Communication is an essential part of human life. We use verbal communication and nonverbal communication on a daily basis. However, since we are always using some form of communication, we often do not put too much thought into gestures given by those who are talking. These gestures include, but are not limited to, facial gestures, body gestures, and hand gestures. If we look closely at gestures, we can find that each culture has their own gestures, but also gestures that are universal to all cultures. For instance, a smile is universal for being happy and approachable, while having crossed arms could be viewed as irritable or unapproachable. If we take away sound and focus only on gestures, we could still be able to understand, to some degree, what others are saying and how they are saying it based on their body language. The important thing to remember is that every culture has a unique way of conveying messages, and that it is always better to play offensively with gestures than defensively. Let's look at some photos of facial features and see if you can determine what emotion they're conveying. This emotion is happiness. It can be shown through a big smile, open eyes, and friendly gestures. We can see here that his chin up and he exudes confidence and happiness. These facial expressions convey anger. We can see that his mouth is slightly downturned and tight together, his nostrils are flaring, and his eyes are squinted. Here we can see the facial expressions of surprise. The eyes are wide open and the mouth is drawn long. Occasionally, the hands will be up on the cheeks as well. Here we can see sadness in her face. Her chin is down, lips are turned down and tightly together, and her eyes look droopy as well. The eyebrows here are left natural on the face. Our facial features are not the only thing that can convey emotions or messages. Next, we're going to look at different body gestures and see what they're conveying. In this picture of Angelina and Brad, we can see from their body gestures and language that they are conveying confidence. Their bodies are straight and open. We can see their arms are slightly back and they're exuding confidence. In this picture, however, we can see that from her body language, she is conveying shyness. Her arms are slightly over her body, which makes it no longer open, and her head is slightly turned down.
For this experiment, we hypothesized that gestures made while speaking can greatly help the audience understand what is being said, regardless of whether or not they know the language. We predict that speakers of some cultures are more difficult to interpret correctly than others when regarding gestures and body movement, but lacking sound. We also believe that we can more precisely predict a speaker's message by watching their gestures if the speaker is from our own culture instead of someone outside of our culture.
For our experiment, we chose a number of different speeches, each from different cultures, and played them for our test subjects. Since our goal was to determine whether or not gestures could help the audience determine what is being said, we played the speeches without any sound and asked them to keep a fine eye out for any head, facial, or body gestures that they saw during the speeches. Our test subjects would watch the speeches for a couple of minutes, and then they would be asked what type of gestures they saw the speaker using and what messages those gestures conveyed to the audience. We recorded their answers and then compared the answers to other test subjects to see how important gestures are in communication and to see if gestures alone could accurately determine one's message nonverbally. We're going to show you a few pictures of the people that were in the speeches. We want you to look closely and see what gestures you can see based on the still photos. The importance of those still photos were to show you that gestures can be communicated even if there is no sound or video.
Here are some examples of the kinds of speeches we played for our subjects while trying to get them to guess what kinds of emotions the speakers were trying to convey. One speech is from an Asian culture, one from a Middle Eastern culture, and one from an American culture, our own culture. See if you can try and guess which emotions each speech conveys. Overall, our results were pretty supportive of our hypothesis. When people watched speeches from an American culture, it was very easy for them to guess what emotions were being conveyed. When they watched speeches from an Asian culture, however, it was nearly impossible for them to guess the emotional content of the speech. Most of the time, the Asian speeches were of positive emotion, but instead the viewers thought that they were talking about negative things with a stern voice and very serious subject matter. The Middle Eastern speeches we played were somewhat difficult for our viewers to guess, but some guessed correctly. Most guessed that they were more angry than they actually were. For the Portuguese and Latin American speeches that we played, the viewers more easily guessed which emotions were being conveyed. This is probably because the Portuguese and Latin American cultures use much more gestures than the Asian cultures, so by watching their gestures without having sound, we have a much better shot at guessing what they're talking about and what kinds of emotions they're trying to convey. When our subjects watched Michelle Obama's speech at the Democratic National Convention, which was a very positive speech, they noticed lots of smiling, waving, touching of the heart, lots of hand movements, and lots of head nodding. When they asked what voice they thought she was using, they said upbeat, happy, thankful, informational, reassuring, and personable. When our viewers watched an Asian speech from Yoshihiko Noda, elected as the Japanese leader, they noticed a deep bow, head nodding, no smiling, the same facial features throughout the entire speech, a still body, very few hand movements, a rigid body, and they said he was not personable, stern, to the point, serious, and informative. When watching the Iran's leader's speech, 30 Years of Revolution, our viewers noticed a serious face, no smiling, a serious posture, lots of pointing, looking around the room, and a glaring. They thought he was using a voice of seriousness They thought he was stern, to the point, informative, cold, mean, and demanding. When watching a Portuguese man give a talk at the TED Talks, viewers noticed lots of gesturing, lots of hand movements, moving across the stage, smiling, and animated hand movements, as if telling a story when he was talking. They guessed he was using a positive voice and that he was talking, telling stories, and giving encouragement. Yeah. When we were finished with our experiment, we concluded that it is very difficult to determine the content of someone speaking from a different culture based on their gestures alone. We must also have some kind of voice to base it off of. We must watch their facial expressions, their body movements, and you also have to take into account the circumstance that you're in. It is most difficult, we concluded, to tell the emotions being conveyed in Asian cultures. Still pretty difficult to tell when you're in a Middle Eastern culture. Easier when you're in a Latin American culture, and of course easiest when you're in an American culture, or any culture that is your own. We also concluded that it is not a great idea to go into a different culture and make assumptions about what people are saying or what emotions they're trying to convey to you just based on the gestures they're making and the facial expressions. And it is not safe to go to a different culture and use gestures like this, or this, or this, or any other normal gestures that have specific meanings in our culture, but could have completely different and even insulting and negative connotations in other cultures. And you could put yourself in serious danger.